Isn't it rich? Aren't we a pair? Me here at last on the ground, you in midair. Send in the clowns. There ought to be clowns. In 1992, Mike Warnke was at the peak of his career. His ministry was taking in over $2 million a year. Among Christian artists, he was one of the top paid at the time. His comedy shows sold out. He was also in high demand as a speaker for various public agencies on the dangers and signs of Satanism. It seemed like this orphan, ex-Satanist, and Vietnam vet had it made. And then an article was published. Part 1. Life. Mike Warnke was born in 1946. In his album, Hey Doc, he recounts his early years as being quite unstructured. He was often taken to his father's truck spot, where he spent most of his time hanging around with truck drivers. At 11, his mother died, and at 12, his father died, leaving him an orphan. Initially, he was taken in by his two aunts. They were two very devoted Christians who did not mesh well with his truck stop manners. The first time he met them after the funeral, he shocked them with using multiple expletives in one sentence. This living relationship did not last long, as his half-sister filed for custody and eventually he was sent to her. Most of the religion that his aunts tried to instill into him did not stick, but their dislike of Catholics did. Mike's first words to his half-sister was that she was going to hell for being a Catholic. His high school years, and all his biographies, of which he has written many, seem to have been unremarkable, except for perchance to hang out with the rougher crowds and parties with drinking benches. Then in the fall of 1965, he started college at San Bernardino. He claims to have been a fast learner, but that this was quickly taken over with a dependency of alcohol. After a few months of binging on it, a fellow college student offered him a toke of marijuana. Reluctant at first, he eventually relented, as he was either wanting to look cool or he wanted something that did not affect his health as badly as the alcohol did. Stories of this vary. He was instantly hooked on MJ and quickly moved on to harder and harder drugs, finally settling on a mixture of alcohol, reds, and speed to get through the days. This college buddy who offered him the weed is identified by the name Dean. Warnke, in the preface to his book, mentions that most of the names are changed to protect people. Dean took a liking to Warnke and soon had him running errands. Warnke did not ask what they were and helped move what he describes as a large amount of drugs and alcohol. Dean paid him with both monies and drugs, and as trust grew, he invited Mike to a few parties. Eventually, it was revealed that the parties were a recruitment tool for the local Satanist covenant, which used drugs, alcohol, and women as a way to introduce men to join. After being in the party scene for a bit, Warnke wanted more and started to talk to Dean about learning more and getting the real power that was only hinted at during the parties. Thus, Dean invited him to a coven meeting that was held in an old barn. These meetings consisted of an altar with a naked woman, a fake sacrifice of her, and the burning of multiple drugs. Warnke could feel the real power these meetings had, and continued, and was soon inducted. During this time, he dropped out of college and soon developed a new schedule. He would wake up at noon or so, go to college to hold court, where he would spend hours wowing the students with his knowledge while talking to them on the greens. More importantly, he sold drugs there and found new recruits for the coven. Later, he would run errands and often take new recruits to parties and private sex parties to help them join the cause. At night, he would fall asleep studying ancient books on his new religion. His dedication paid off, and before he knew it, Dean tapped him to run the coven when Dean got promoted. Warnke took the job and was rewarded after a swearing-in ceremony. He came home to his apartment to find it clean, new furniture, and 2 live-in women who were there to do whatever he needed. Whatever he needed. It looked to be a great decision because it didn't take long for him to raise the membership from under 1,000 to over 1,500. He instituted real sacrifices of cats and eventually fingers of members who were really dedicated. These fingers would be consumed at the ceremonies. He mentioned at the time that his coven was doing so much that the local news started running reports about missing pets. The ceremonies continued in base acts, with them culminating with a ceremonial group rape of a woman nabbed off the streets. Word of his success was passed around, and again Warnke was asked to see what the next level was. He was invited to a large business gatherings where he met many of the highest in the religion. They asked him for his ideas and how to grow, and he learned. Yet despite seeing what was the highest of his group, he knew or felt that there was more. For one, there was always a group of people who would show up at rituals but never actually participate, but would sometimes make requests for Mike's coven to pass on to demons. He never confirmed who they really were, but he did hear the word Illuminati bandied about. Second, despite having power to control demons, Mike realized at one of these events that the devil was the most powerful, and while he was helping his humans, it was obviously that he hated humans as well. The point of the trips were to encourage Mike and show him the future in the organization. Instead, he returned from the trips frightened. He started to use his choice substances more, and his abuse of them was noticeable. Hints of delusional paranoia started to creep into him, and eventually it got too much for the coven. One night, one of his 2 girls brought him a needle full of heroin and injected it. Mike instantly knew it was too much and felt himself lose control of his body. A bunch of people he had called friends came in and dragged his body to a dump site. Somehow Mike survived the overdose and was sent to a hospital to detox. After detoxing, his prospects were not good. He had no friends, no money, no job, and soon found himself being hounded by college campus evangelists. Thinking of no other way out, he joined the Navy. During the boot camp, he was roomed with the only 2 Christians in his class. They repeatedly witnessed to him and showed him acts of love, like shining his boots. The breaking point was him accidentally hurting one of the 2 men. Instead of the hate and the fight he expected, the young man told Warnke, through a face of blood, that he cared for him and wanted to see him saved. Warnke fled the room only to find the other young man's Bible out in the rec hall. It was turned to the scripture John 3:16. Warnke spent the rest of the night praying. The next few months, Warnke finished boot camp and then an additional training on how to be a corpsman. He felt that saving lives would be the best way he could serve God. Not long after he got saved, he got some time off and returned to his hometown. There he met a girl he had known and crushed on in high school. They did it, and by the time he shipped off, Mike was married. Because the Marines do not train their own corpsmen, he got assigned to a Marine battalion, and instead of spending his time in a boat, he found himself in Vietnam marching through the jungles. His many biographies have different parts of his time in Vietnam covered, but the short story of it is that he spent time witnessing to the troops, carrying more than his load, and being wounded once in the middle of a firefight by an arrow. After his first tour, he signed up for 6 more years for a bonus and a chance to go to cardiopulmonology training. He expected to spend the rest of the time helping sick people stateside and following God. But as he mentions in his book, The Satan Seller, God had other plans for him. Through church, he met some other Christians who helped him in many ways. First, they helped him get fully free of the coven. Despite quitting, once he returned to America, he found himself being approached by a woman who had been in it. She begged him to come back. When he refused, he started to have a demon attack him and almost kill him. There were also times where the woman would astral project in his house at night to scare him. His Christian friends helped him receive the Holy Ghost, which was the power he was able to fully pray away the attacks. They also helped convince him to write a book about his experiences with Satanism and the work to get out of the Navy as a conscientious objector. They succeeded in both. After his discharge, he started to tour the country talking about Satanism. His timing is great, as there had been a bunch of other books and documentaries released at the same time that helped show America the growing rise of Satanism. He had a ton of speaking engagements, including Oprah Winfrey and 2020. Somewhere along the tours, he started to work comedy into his speaking, and by 1992 his acts had become a blend of humor, frightening stories of Satan's power, and a call to the cross. He also in this time started up a hotline for those trying to get out of satanic cults, and a boarding house for those who had succeeded in leaving and needing somewhere to live. Warnke had lived through a literal hell and came out of it strong in his faith and blessed by God. Part 2. Reveal. In 1992, Cornerstone Magazine, Volume 21, Issue 98, printed an article written by John Trott and Mike Hertenstein. The article was named Selling Satan, and it was the result of a year-long investigation by the two authors, the results of which called almost every fact and piece of information known about Mike Warnke and his testimony into question. They based their research on interviews with former friends, relatives, and employees of Mike Warnke. This was combined with publicly available military documents. Mike Warnke at the time of this publication was making a living as both a professional speaker and a comedian. As most comedians who draw from life, some creative liberties can be expected, especially for the sake of comedy. But the investigation showed a story that went beyond stretching the truth. It uncovered fraud, embezzlement, and flat-out fiction. It was shown to be true that Mike had become an orphan by the age of 12, but interviews with his aunts reveal a well-spoken, nice-tempered young man who did not floor them with vulgarities. They did, however, admit to raising him to be anti-Catholic, and his stepsister was able to confirm that his first thing he said to her was that she was going to hell. But friends, priests, school records, and his sister, rather than show a boy who rejected the teachings, showed one that grew into them. His closest two friends did not confirm his stories of late-night drinking parties in high school. However, they did have some information confirmed by others that do shed light on his life. Even as a young teen, Warnke had a great gift of making up stories and then sticking to them. He even excelled with coming up with explanations to inconsistencies and was rarely ever able to be dissuaded from the stories he came up with. College is where the changes between the reality that Warnke states and the observable reality that others saw happened. Warnke was seen as a decent student with some friends, but not as much as anything else. He was clean cut and stopped after their first semester to join the Navy. He was never the overweight, long, bleached, blonde-haired, dark clothes-wearing sociopath he described. Pictures of the time back up his friends' recounting of the story. On college at the time, the 60s, marijuana was not the thing for these students. There was still a stigma of the documentary Reefer Madness, and people who were into campus during the same time mentioned that rather than a glut of drugs that Warnke stated that he bought and sold, there was in fact a famine. No one could recall the young man Warnke named as Dean. A further hindrance of Warnke's story was the fiancée he forgot to mention in his biographies. The college man Warnke tried to describe himself as was a man with no emotional attachments who jumped from bed to bed at every chance. His fiancée states that she spent every day with him until he went to boot camp. There wasn't a day he was gone, and she definitely did not notice him turning into a leader of a coven. Although she did recognize some of the places in his stories, such as a pool hall where he claimed to have been shot, she stated that they were just places they went on dates with together. And even if he managed to hide most of his activities from her, there was no way she didn't notice the multiple broken bones, stab wounds, repeated cases of hepatitis from drug use, or the many times he claimed to have been out of state on satanic conventions that lasted multiple days. A few of his friends did remember getting a form sent to them to sign, affirming that the stories in the book were true, but not one of them did, as the stories they read were not. In the end, there was no evidence that Warnke had ever been to a satanic meeting, much less a coven that controlled the drug trade of California and who had the local police in their pockets. This is just the beginning of the unraveling of Warnke's story. In his multiple books and many comedy acts/testimonials, Mike Warnke has given differing accounts of when he got saved, how he got saved, why he was a medic, how long he was in the Marine Corps, and how many times he was wounded. Besides the story in the intro, he once stated that the start for him on the road to salvation was running into a woman he had gang raped. She told him that she forgave him because Christ wanted him to. Warnke offered the reason he became a medic was that this is what God wanted, but in other sources where the choice was made before his salvation, it was because he was fooled by a recruiter who convinced him medics had access to nurses and drugs. Sometimes his story of the Bible is just something that happened. Other times it was after he ran away from his bloodied roommate. The number of times he has been wounded numbered between 1 to 5, depending on when or where he told the story. He also has claimed at various times to have not hurt anyone, to having killed a spy, and in addition to killing a man in a bar fight at Vietnam. There are stories where he claims to have been a good Christian throughout Vietnam, and stories where he talks about falling into alcoholism. What the authors were able to determine was that 1. Mike Warnke actually was a member of the Christian group Campus Crusade. This is a group that he claimed he had joined the military to get away from. 2. That he did come back from the boot camp more radicalized for Jesus. 3. That his service in Vietnam only lasted 6 months, much too short for the long list of events and injuries he mentions. 4. That he was wounded once, and for this he received a Purple Heart. After a stint in Vietnam, Warnke did re-enlist and did go to cardiopulmonary school. There are a few things to note in this timeline. When Mike Warnke came back from boot camp, he did claim a new dedication to Christianity, and he used this as a reason to break up with his fiancée Lois, whereupon he almost immediately started dating and then marrying his first wife, Sue. The pattern repeated with his other 3 wives. Another thing that becomes important is where he spent his time off work. For a while, Mike Warnke volunteered at the Drug Prevention Center, or the Hotline, that was a local ministry to addicts. It is likely here that Mike learned the ins and outs of drug use that he later used in his stories. Despite projecting an image of a Christ-following minister, there was more in Mike's story. Before the 1992 publication, he had been married 4 times. In each case, he broke up with his previous spouse, only to immediately start dating the next. The authors found numerous corroborating testimony that he had started dating his future spouses before divorcing the current one. A few of his ex-wives have claimed that he physically abused them. Now, it must not be said that Mike hid his infidelity and divorces from everyone. In the industry, it's an open secret, and somewhere between his marriage to his 4th wife and the exposé, Mike did release a book with his 3rd ex-wife regarding how Christians should deal with divorce. But for those who attended his sermon or concerts, this information was not given out. Finally, attention was put into his ministry, or lack of it. Warnke billed himself as a Christian comedian, but this was only part of the ministry he stated he was doing. In a lot of his concerts and public appearances, he also promoted his ministry, Warnke Ministries, a ministry that ran tax-exempt under the organization the Holy Orthodox Catholic Church in Kentucky, HOCCK, an organization founded and ran by Mike Warnke. During his performances and appearances, Mike would receive proceeds not only from his appearance fee and merchandise sales, but from a love offering. Mike Warnke pushed for donations to his foundation, both in the mail and in the past plate, so that he could set up a framework and structure needed to help those trapped in Satanism. His publicized efforts in his goal, other than his education to law enforcement, was a house set up for those who were leaving Satanism and a helpline. The Cornerstone investigation brought serious accusations against the ministry. While a building was built to house those who were leaving Satanism, it was never used as such, and no indications were ever seen that it was meant to be used. First, there was a large house bought and owned by Blanche Hall, mother to then Warnke wife Rose Hall. This was rented from her by HOCCK for several years before being sold to Rose. Then there was a piece of land in Bergen, Kentucky, which was stated to become the much publicized and promised halfway home for Reformed Satanists. What was built was an office complex that housed offices for those who worked to engage Warnke in further speaking engagements. A phone line was set up, and instead of the 50,000 calls a month Warnke claimed to be receiving, it would on average receive about 6 calls a day. The one part-time employee who was hired for this line was instructed to point callers to other resources. Those who wrote letters asking to send someone to the house were told it was not ready yet, but any donations for it were accepted. The books show at the end of Warnke Ministries he was taking in $2 million a year. In the last year accessible to Cornerstone, 1990, his salary was $239,291 a year, while Rose's was $230,291. But this is not the true amount he was paid by the ministry. Those who worked in the office were often instructed to use funds to pay for various personal bills and needs of the Warnkes, and it was often a struggle to get the money in the first place, as when the love offerings were taken, an employee had to race to beat Mike or Rose to the intake, or they would often find torn open empty envelopes with only check donations left. Part 3. Aftermath. So what happens when your ministry has been exposed as a fraud? Well, initially, what one would expect to happen happened. A capture of stories from the paper Lexington Herald Leader, the closest paper to Warnke's then home, gives the first year a good summary. The IRS went after his nonprofit ministry. Warnke first stood by his testimony before giving a qualified mea culpa. His record label tried to weather the storm, but dropped him. His ministry was disbanded. Not long after the publication, Mike Warnke found himself having gone from rich to wondering if he needed pet food or toilet paper more because he cannot afford both. One of the jokes that Mike Warnke used to say in his comedy show was that the Christian army is the only army that shoots its wounded. He was pointing out that when someone sins in the ministry, it can really hurt them more than it would someone not in the ministry, a somewhat prophetic word for him. But looking at what happened next in Warnke's life, it seems as if there should have been an additional statement. We then pray for our dead, raise them up, and let them continue on. Despite being widely seen as a fraud, liar, cheat, adulterer, and a host of other sins, Warnke soon found himself back to a growing ministry. It is by no means the size it was, but he is now accepted in the Christian community as a motivational speaker and a comedian. How did this happen? Well, the first step was he divested himself of the Warnke ministry and the HOCCK organization. Then he submitted himself to a board of ministers that he selected. They helped him set up a new ministry called Celebration of Hope, which they monitored. He submitted himself to their recommendations, and after 13 years of advisement, they released him from being governed by them and no longer under their limitations. Some of the steps they took was to have him write a confession, to work in the ministry while having no influence in the board of Celebration of Hope, and following professional rules they put in place. For following their advice, he now has a 40-page document that is sent out from his ministry of the board talking about what ways he has improved, their disagreement with the Cornerstone report, and their now good faith in him. After his release from the tribunal, he wrote a book in 2002 named Friendly Fire, a recovery guide for believers battered by religion. A book in how he was unfairly treated by the Christians after the Cornerstone publication. Mike Warnke is still preaching and working in the ministry. Conclusion. Thoughts. Up to now, I've tried to keep my opinion on the whole matter out of the narrative, and in the cases where it slipped through, I offer my apologies. But I cannot end this whole retrospective of Mike Warnke without adding my own thoughts and personal experiences. In the beginning, I mentioned that his book helped start a reform by Christians against the incursion of Satan in America. This movement is now known as the Satanic Panic. At some point, I would like to do a video on the whole sordid thing, but for now, a summary will do. Warnke's book, along with some of the other media and incidents, all of which have been shown to be false, started a Christian culture of fear that the devil was winning. This fear extended beyond just the church and influenced law enforcement and journalism for decades. Multiple child care workers had their jobs and lives ruined by false allegations this movement encouraged. Some even ended up in jail for years. Those of us among the funded groups who were kids were also victims of the repercussions. Many of us were taken out of schools, forbidden from popular entertainment, and made to feel terrified of the world. Some of us have survived, some of us didn't, and some of us are still stuck in that mindset. Warnke used Christian gullibility and fear to make money, and while he did lose it, he is no longer held accountable for his role. He has a ministry, he still preaches, and he still spreads fear, albeit in a smaller setting. The tribunal board he picked stated that there were issues with the investigation Cornerstone made, and that Mike gave them proof of this. They have never released the proof, and Mike has never made it publicly available. What they call comedic exaggerations include him making what he now claims a 13-person satanic cult into one that contained 1,500 people. He has never stated that he lied in any of it, but instead exaggerated or dramatized it. In his statement to the tribunal, he states that he never intended his book to be a fact-by-fact account, but his actions after writing the book do not show this. He took money from law enforcement to teach them how to watch out for the Satanism he largely made up. He made millions preaching the Christian life, while in the background was living a life that would horrify most Christians. This former Satanism seller was selling something, and it wasn't Satan, but it sure smelled. Thanks for watching this unusual episode of my show. From time to time, I hope to do a larger retrospective of different religious figures who have not met the standards they hold for others. If you have someone you would like me to look into, please let me know. I know many of the mainstream Christian ones, but would really like to know who to look at in other religions. If you think this was a neat episode, please like it, share it, and make a comment. This one took a lot of work, and while the knowledge learned is a reward in itself, seeing that others enjoyed it is even better. If you'd like to follow what is going on for me, be sure to check out my Twitter at atheist_t_girl. My PayPal is listed in the information bar for this video, and if you'd like to throw me a tip, thank you. In addition, any drawings that appeared in this video were done by my son, who is taking commissions. If you'd like to have him draw something for you, please let me know. This is Atheist T-Girl, hoping you have a great day.